Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of ancient Greece, right? We just got our toes wet a little bit in class today, talking about ancient Greek geography, talking about the things that they could grow, and not gonna lie, period one, right? Period one in Miss Tax's room, y'all crushed it today. I was very impressed. Big shout out to like Madison with two S's, the Madison with the D that's over there, Audrey, right? A couple other kids were really participating, stuff like that, like Julia today. Really awesome stuff. Very, very impressed. Y'all are really crushing it. Very impressed. Number one thing about it, though, going into it, is we really got into like the time periods, right? We know that we're stair-stepping our way through ancient Greece, and we know that we are looking at ancient Greece as like our first archetype or cookie cutter of like a Western civilization, right? And ancient Greece is super impactful because it still dramatically affects us on an everyday basis, right? Like I guarantee you that you could go out into the world and find things in everyday life that are ancient Greek by like culture or our holdovers from that ancient time period, right? You'd be surprised, but I guarantee it, right? We talked about how they have really bad farmland. We talked about geographic isolation, how it led to the multiple city-states popping up in ancient Greece, right? Like Athens and Sparta and many other ones that we'll talk about later on. We also talked about how like literally their island-style natural harbors, the Aegean and the Ionian, everything being there, really lent itself with that terrible farmland to being much more of a trade empire. And they also love to trade things like grapes, wine, grains, and like olives and olive oil as well, right? Olive oil in particular, all right? So going into it though, we left off right there in class, but let's pick it up a little bit and let's get into our first time period. So now what we're going to be doing for ancient Greece is we're just going to be stair-stepping our way through the time periods, right? There's 8 of them total, so you'll know whenever we get to like the Hellenistic period, that test, Lily, is coming up any minute after that, right? So going into it, though, we need to understand that we are starting off with Neolithic Greece, right? And Neolithic Greece, we literally cook down into one slide. Because that's all it needs, because it's very, very simple, because we talked about this already, right? Neolithic period, or the Neolithic period in general, is just that transition from Paleolithic time period into the Neolithic time period, when that big moment of the invention of farming happened and caused that general shift, right? The Neolithic period, or Neolithic Greeks, are just going to be the earliest signs of civilization. They're going to have early cities that showed evidence of farming, pottery, religion, right? For example, we've discovered some different idols and items that look like it might be the roots of ancient Greek polytheism. By the way, polytheism is going to be a really important word as we get into the archaic Greeks in particular. Polytheism meaning that they believe in multiple gods, not just one, right? And then also these early cities and settlements left a lot of stuff around, right? Fun fact also, interestingly enough, that you actually can like know this is for a little bit later. Whenever you're like studying as an anthropologist or as an archaeologist, whenever you're studying ancient Greek or ancient sites, period, you're always supposed to go one place in particular. Their trash, right? Like you go to their trash and you can actually see things they ate, maybe plants that grow around there because of that waste and stuff like that. You can find different items like shards of pottery or things that were handmade, right? And also some of the earliest pieces of Neolithic pottery actually show us that there were like some artistic sides to it as well as functional uses, right? So going into it though, once that ancient Greek time period of the Neolithic period kind of begins, it then begins to wade its way into another time period, right? And so we're done with the Neolithic one because it's just basically the invention of farming and the earliest signs of civilization. And now we're moving into what is known as the early Bronze Era Greeks, right? Or the Bronze Era in general. Now, the thing about it, though, is that the Bronze Era is a little bit of a weird one because technically speaking, the Bronze Era covers not only the Neolithic, well, not even necessarily the Neolithic period, but the Bronze Era, or the early Bronze Age. It also covers the Minoans and the Mycenaeans that we're going to get into here pretty soon, okay? So the early Bronze Era Greeks are going to range from about 3200 to 2000 BC, and it's going to cover mostly just the introduction of metallurgy, right? It's defined by the introduction of metallurgy of forgeable metals, right? What a forgeable metal means is it means it's a metal that can be heated up to a certain point and then it can be either hammered into another piece of metal and forged together, or it can actually be sharpened and actually malleable in creating metallurgical items, right? So smithing in general, okay? Now the earliest Greeks, quote unquote, who didn't even call themselves Greeks yet, they would not even have like referred to themselves as such, they haven't even invented written language yet, right? Defined by this early introduction of bronze, right? Now, what bronze is very, very important, okay? Bronze is a hybrid alloy, right? A bronze is an alloy. It's not necessarily just a metal, okay? Well, it is a metal, but it doesn't come out of the earth just as bronze, right? So, now, what bronze is, it's a mixture. Now, you should write this down. It's going to be very important to the progression of the society because they're actually creating an alloy as a forgeable metal first, and this metal will eventually get superseded by another one a little bit later on, but we're going to wait on that one. see if y'all can actually figure it out. Now, the big thing about it, though, is what is bronze, though? It is a mixture of two different metals that are naturally occurring in the earth. It is a mixture of copper and tin, right? Copper and tin are going to be mixed together to create what is known as bronze, right? Now, bronze is usually a brownish kind of tinged color or something like that, but as you can see over time, it oxidizes, and the atoms inside of the copper, as it begins to oxidize, begin to turn green. And they not only made weaponry out of bronze, but they also made religious artifacts and art out of bronze as well. And this introduction around 3200 BC is going to be a very, very pivotal turning point for the growth of ancient Greece, right? Because now they are making forgeable metal to actually maybe possibly make art or wage war, right? Which is going to be really, really big coming up soon, okay? But the big thing about it is it's time to get serious, right? We're now moving into our very first group of Greeks that are much more measurable, much more understandable, much more knowable, right? And we're talking about none other than the ancient Minoans, right? Now, the Minoans are the first legitimate civilization to pop up in the area of what you would consider ancient Greece. And they show up around 2000 BC. Now, the thing about it that we need to kind of clarify before we even talk about this group of people known as the Minoans, right, is that they actually, we've only really known about them for a little bit of time, because on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do we really know about the Minoans from a historiography and or from a historical sense? Y'all, it's like a 2. Like, we don't know a lot about them, mostly due to the fact that we've only known about them since the early 1900s, right? Like, the early 1900s, right around 1904, this guy is going to discover some of the earliest artifacts and some of the earliest settlements of this area on this very specific island off the coast of Greece, right? And he's a guy by the name of Sir Arthur Evans, right? Sir Arthur Evans is a British archaeologist, obviously, because it's Sir Arthur Evans, which means that his discovery was so important. Ironically enough, he didn't even discover it first. He actually kind of took the discovery from a Greek archaeologist, but we're not going to get into that right now. So Sir Arthur Evans is credited, for the most part, of excavating and also like dialoguing and not dialoguing. What's the word I'm looking for? Excavating and what's the word? Not filing. I'll think of it later. But he's the one that's most responsible and given the most credit for the overall discovery of the Minoan civilization, right? Even though other people had actually kind of come into contact with these ruins a little bit earlier. Now, Sir Arthur Evans, which you should have him written down, was so important after this discovery that he was knighted, right? And so he actually held high amongst British anthropologists, right? Now, going into it, though, what he discovered, though, was a very important site. But really quickly, we need to know where, because Greece is a large area, right? Like, so it's a peninsular style area with tons of different islands that include a very, very large group of, like, you got like Santorini, Mykonos, like a lot of different islands all over the place, hundreds of them. So where specifically was the Minoan city-state discovered? Well, it was discovered on this island right off the coast of Greece, okay? So this is the mainland area of Greece that we'll talk about a little bit later on. It's going to be the bulk of what we talk about of the goings-on of ancient Greece. And that area is known as Peloponnese, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But Sir Arthur Evans discovered this civilization of the Minoans on this island right here in the Mediterranean Sea that is technically a part of Greece itself. It is known as Crete, all right? Crete, C-R-E-T-E, Crete. The island of Crete is where he discovered these ruins right here, which are the remains of possibly an ancient palace, right? Created and made and constructed by the Minoans themselves in 2000 BC, right? 2,000 years before Christ was ever even born. They were building large-scale architecture, right? Now, these Minoans, though, are going to set up a lot of standards going forward for ancient Greek civilizations and different kinds of things and art and architecture and stuff like that. But when we look at the remains of what Sir Arthur Evans found, he named it the Palace of Kinosis, right? The Palace of Kinosis, right? This is that area that serves as the main piece of evidence for the Minoan civilization, right? Now, this is what we believe possibly that Kinosis looked like when it was fully constructed, right? As you can see, it's multiple levels. It has an open interior courtyard. It looks like it actually might have columns on the outside of it, these red ones that you can actually see also in this. Okay, some of these have been reconstructed, but these red columns right there that are actually on the outside of the palace as well from the ancient ruins. You can see some of them back here in the back as well, but it seems as though that they are going to set some of the earliest architectural standards and some of the earliest Greek standards for the Greeks going forward. We're not positive about exactly what Kinosis may have been, but but we don't know a lot about it, but we do know that they are the foundation for what we call Greek, right? Like when we say Greek, it seems as though that the Minoans may have started some of the earliest things that transposed themselves into even classical Greeks, later on even like Hellenistic Greeks, right? And let me start over. They may have started a lot of cultural standards that when we consider ancient Greece, it's the things we think of, right? Like so going into it though, the Palace of Kinosis and the study of the Minoans was going to be very pivotal in our understanding of the growth of the ancient Greek civilization, because the Minoans are going to be really, really important to understand a lot about, did the Greeks know about each other, right? Like when we looked at that time period, y'all, 8 Greek time periods spanning from 7000 BC to 33 BC, like you're talking about a very large swath of time. So do we even know if other Greeks amongst these timelines knew about the other Greeks that came before them, right? And that's why the Minoans are so crucial, because it shows us a lot of stuff that these Greeks might have known about each other, right? So going into it though, you have to understand that also the Palace of Kinosis is not the only site ever discovered that is in relation to the Minoan people, right? The Kinosis Palace is right here, located on the edge of the northern area of the island, but there's also Myla and Phaistos and stuff like that. Phaistos is where another very important artifact is actually going to be found as well, a little bit later on. You can still even go and visit this site to this day, like in Crete. I've been there. It's not that special. Like, it's just like a lot of rocks and stuff. Like that one picture you see is actually mostly reconstructed of the ruins itself and stuff like that. And so it's like not the most amazing thing. I'd rather go to the Parthenon. I mean, it's a little bit better. So like, now the thing about it though is the Minoans though. Where does this name come from, right? Now, why are they called the Minoans? Do the Minoans call themselves that? Do we even know what the Minoans may have called themselves? Interestingly enough, Sir Arthur Evans is the man that named them, right? He named them after a very specific person in Greek myth, right? Like, so like there was a guy that apparently, according to classical Athenian like mythology, right, there was this dude named King Minos, right? And King Minos apparently was a terrible, evil king that lived on an island far away from the mainland of Greece, according to ancient Greeks, okay? Like I'm talking about a story right now that the Athenians, that the classical Athenians, thousands of years before Sir Arthur Evans was ever even alive, like they had a tale, a myth, a story about this terrible evil king named King Minos, who lived on an island in a palace off the coast of Greece, far away from Athens and stuff like that. And apparently he lived in the Palace of Kinosis, right? And so the idea is that Sir Arthur Evans believes that he had found the palace that King Minos himself had actually lived in, right? Now we're going to get into the muddy waters of what is myth and what is history, because in the long run, is King Minos real? Probably not, right? Like, so, like, is the Palace of Kinosis real? Maybe not, right? Like, so, not this palace, but the mythological one. But he named it that because a lot of the elements of the story seem to match up with this particular archaeological site, right? And you can actually see in all of these pictures right here, in particular, that it seems apparent to us that the Minoans may have been highly intelligent, right? Building with column-style architecture, which is going to be really, really important as things begin to grow forward. Because when we get into classical Greeks and archaic Greeks, you're going to notice that this type of construction holds over for several thousand years, and they start building columns of their own. Now, these are Minoan columns, so the weird thing about them is they are narrower at the bottom than they are at the top, which is very odd for a column, right? And also, it doesn't have a a very, very thick pedestal and stuff. But it's okay, to each their own. So now the big thing about that also that you need to understand is that this palace was multi-leveled. It had several different floors and sets of stairs. It also had walls that cut off several different rooms, right? We believe that this may have been a throne room, possibly an offering room, maybe a religious room. We're not really positive because, again, we don't know a lot about the Minoans because they didn't leave behind a certain thing to give us to read, but we'll get into that here in about 2 seconds. But they also were very ingenious because, I don't know if you know this or not, but they invented plumbing. So they didn't invent it, but the Minoans had a system at the Palace of Kinosis of plumbing. So when they went to the bathroom, it went away. That's brilliant.
Indoor plumbing, it's gonna be big.
Exactly. Thank you for the Hercules reference, all right? Indoor plumbing, it's gonna be big. Now, the big thing about it, though, is literally the Minoans seem to be a very, very brilliant, ingenious ancient civilization, creating ways to dispose of waste, creating different types of art forms that cover these walls and stuff like that we'll get into here a little bit later. But the reason why this is the principal site of the Minoan kingdom, and the reason why it was named the Palace of Kinosis and then later on known as the Minoans, a lot of it has to do with the fact that this palace, or possibly marketplace, we're not really even sure that the Palace of Kinosis is a palace in the first place. We think it might have been a marketplace. We're not really positive, right? But the thing about it is it was built in a labyrinth-style format, right? So when you look at the floor plan of the Palace of Kinosis, it looks almost like a maze. And that's what the word labyrinth means, right? It means a maze-like structure, all right? So the thing about it, though, is that with that maze-like structure, we believe that Sir Arthur Evans may have named them the Minoans, because in the story, the ancient Greek story about King Minos, the Minotaur, and Theseus, right? There's a very, very elaborate part of it where literally Theseus must find his way through, through a maze. All right, so now going into it though as well, you have to understand that there were also artifacts found all over the place as well, around like Kinosis and stuff, that were bull artifacts, right? Which also then again possibly relates itself to that Minotaur myth, right? That the classical Athenians may have actually known about them, right? And so also that's the question that really needs to be answered more than any other one is, did the other Greeks know about these Greeks before we even knew about these Greeks? So basically, like, how do we know that they knew that they know that we know that they know?
Joey, do they know that we know?
No.
Joey?
They know you know.
Oh, I knew it! Oh, I cannot believe those two.
They thought that they could mess with us? They're trying to mess with us? They don't know that we know they know we know. And Joey, you can't say anything.
Couldn't if I wanted to.
Exactly, that's the feeling, right? We don't know, like, how do we know that they knew about each other, right? Well, a lot of it breaks itself down to these different art forms, to their culture, and how they seem so interrelated, right? For example, like the Minotaur myth and the fact that we have found so many numerous bull-like artifacts littered all over the Palace of Kinosis seem to line up almost perfectly, right? The idea that there was a labyrinth-style maze in a story that was being told thousands of years ago about a vindictive king that lived far away, that seems that might be a way that they kept their history, right? Like this right here is one of the most important artifacts from the Palace of Kinosis. It's a fresco that, as you can see, has been reconstructed. That this was like an area that was left behind by it, and all of these little places that are raised plaster are parts of the original painting itself. But what it seems to look like, we're not absolutely positive, but apparently this is known as the bull leaping fresco, right? And we don't know if it's necessarily like a sport. We don't know if it was like a religious ceremony, but it seems to tie in heavily to that idea of man versus beast, right? But yes, it's known as the bull leaping fresco, right? And so that's the thing about it, is that the Minoans literally, we believe, have been referenced in myth more than anything else, because myths from 1,000 years later tell us more than the artifacts do themselves, right? And the thing that we need to talk about, and I'm not going to get into that myth particularly big right now, we'll talk about it in class a little bit, we'll talk about the story of Theseus and the Minotaur and how those two things seem to line up almost perfectly, but what is the point of myths in general? Why did Greeks tell myths in the first place? What was like the idea behind them? Well, the thing about it is that the Greeks didn't have science, right? They didn't have like scientific study and experimentation. They were using a lot more of things like logic and understanding, right? And trying to figure out ways to like kind of link the ideas of the natural world and the real world and the spiritual world together. So they used myths to explain things they didn't understand, but they also use myths to document history. And so that could be told orally over and over and over again, regardless of if the civilization had a writing system or not, right? And that's a very important factor here, right? How do the myths relate to the growth and the disappearance of the Minoans for 1,000 years? Because the thing about it is even when Sir Arthur Evans discovered this area, discovered the Isle of Crete site of the Palace of Kinosis and the Minoan people that lived there, writing was found, and it's called Linear A, right? Like, so now the writing system looks like this. This right here is the most prominent artifact that's been found of Minoan writing. It's called the Phaistos disc, right? And the Phaistos disc was not discovered in the Palace of Kinosis. It was actually discovered on the other side of Crete, in an area called Phaistos, right? And we believe that this is an inscription of some type of Minoan-style writing. But the problem is that it's completely undecipherable. Like, I mean, you got a bunch of goofy little symbols on here that are repeating themselves, and we don't have any basis or understanding of how to translate it. It looks almost like hieroglyphic or ancient Egyptian in manner, right? Like, you got the gingerbread man from Shrek over here doing things, and he's like, oh, do you know the Muffin Man? And, like, it's doing all that weird stuff. We don't really know what's going on. But historians rely much more on Minoan artifacts and art, like frescoes and these myths, to understand their goings-on. Because in the long run, we have these artifacts, but we don't know a lot about Minoan history, period. But we do know some other things about them through the frescoes they left behind. Now, frescoes were really important inside the Palace of Kinosis to try and understand some things about their culture, right? For example, what a fresco is, though, it's a style of art, right? And fresco is basically wet plaster, okay, on a dry wall. And what they would do is they paint the plaster before it dries, and when it dries, it becomes permanent, and the things bond together, right? Now, the frescoes here, okay, that have been heavily reconstructed, seem to demonstrate or depict possibility of female priests, right? So maybe maybe women were actually of a higher rank in Minoan society and allowed to participate in religion, which is a really, really big thing as well. Because this tells us, this idea of the female priest fresco tells us that maybe, okay, unlike much of the rest of Greece, because for example, women had almost no rights whatsoever in ancient Athens, maybe the ancient Minoans actually valued women as higher places in society, right? But we also know this fresco very well is also, this one actually may be depicting possibly a natural disaster occurring, right? Maybe that kind of helps us figure out what happened to the Minoans. We're not positive, but we also see a large number of ships in the water, right? Some like boats that could have been used as trading vessels and dolphins in the background, demonstrating to us that maybe the Minoans were a seafaring people, right? That's a big thing, is the number of boats and the level of actually like the depiction of more aquatic scenes and things like that show us that there's a chance that they were actually very, very adept at trading, and that maybe they came into contact with the earliest Athenians or other groups of people, right? This right here, for example, we believe is a woman gathering saffron flowers in the Palace of Kinosis, and saffron is used as a food and a dye at the time more than anything else. It was extremely expensive and very hard to come by, so it probably would have been used as a trade product, right? So the thing about it is that we believe that they might have been much more like adept at art and trade and seafaring and stuff like that. And the thing about it is that we have found artifacts, though, not only in Crete, but also in other places. Because no one is certain why, but right around 1400 BC, the Minoans began to fall. Now, referencing back to that last fresco, could have been a natural disaster. We're not positive, right? Or they could have possibly been taken over, right? Due to the fact that we have some artifacts, like this one right here, known as the Philo cup, right? This golden cup that has been forged out of some type of gold leafing and bronze as well, right, was not found in Crete. It was actually found on mainland Greece in an area called Peloponnese, right? And it was found in a different area, not owned and operated by the Myans. It was actually found underneath a different group of people, because right around this time, right around 1400 BC, another group of people in the mainland began to expand and take power, and they were called the Mycenaeans. And this cup right here, that is a Minoan artifact, was discovered in the Mycenaean area, and they were much more all about war and their intense culture, and they were growing on the mainland, so we believe that they may have conquered the Minoans right around the period of like 1400, and then taken them over and disperse them. And they're going to be very important in our discussion going forward, because we're going to talk about their different like kind of eras of like how we like mark their history, and we're going to talk a lot about them as well in class, all right? But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.